Good afternoon. Money laundering is estimated to amount to between 2 and 5% of global GDP annually. And less than 1% of the proceeds laundered by the financial system are currently seized and frozen by regulatory and law enforcement agencies. This is, of course, very problematic, to say the least. Therefore, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the release seminar for our new research report, Money Laundering and Whistleblowers. In this report provides an overview and analysis of the current anti-money laundering regulatory framework, as well as ideas on how to improve it. The authors, Giancarlo Spagnolo and Theo Nyreröd, will start by presenting the highlights and main conclusions from the report. Then our invited commentators will share their reflections on the analysis and recommendations of the authors. And finally, there will also be a panel discussion where you in the audience are very welcome to participate with questions and commentaries. If you participate digitally, there is a form on your screen where you can write your questions anytime during the session, and then Angelica, my colleague, will bring them up during the panel discussion. If you are here, you will simply raise your hand when the time comes. My name is Ilinca Benson. I am Deputy CEO here at SNS, and I will moderate this discussion and seminar. So let me introduce Giancarlo and Theo, who are with us digitally. Maybe we can get them here on the screen as well. So Giancarlo Spagnolo is Professor of Economics at Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics at the Stockholm School of Economics. And Theo Nyreröd is PhD candidate at Brunel Law School. And we will start off with them presenting the main conclusions from the report. So I give the screen and floor to you, Giancarlo. Very welcome.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I start with a disclaimer that all what we say is not shared by side of the Stockholm School of Economics or SNS, of course. It's our personal views. Okay, so I did a disclaimer. This is a joint work with Theo, who is online with me. So let me briefly talk about the first part of the report, and then Theo will jump in for the second part. As you see from the title, we agreed to work on the connection between money laundering and whistleblowers. We are more expert on whistleblowers than on money laundering. We have learned a lot during this report. And let's see why we connect these two phenomena. Theo, can you switch slide, please? So we just heard that money laundering is a huge issue in terms of amount of money. And the World Bank estimates are wide, between 1.7 and 4.2 trillions of dollars. We know that money laundering is essential for all type of illegal activities, from the smallest one to less, up to the most cruel, and from terrorism. Dictators, plundering their own countries and so on. They need to hide and then use this illegal proceeding, and this requires money laundering. We believe, journalists and people that estimate this phenomenon believe that the amount of money that needs to be laundered is increasing, the amount of fraud is increasing, and so on. There are many ways of laundering money. Cryptocurrencies has become one of the main ways. We will not talk about all these other ways. We just focus on financial institutions because we were asked to do that. So we talk about, in particular, European financial institutions. And this idea of this report started with the so-called scandals of things happening in Scandinavia after having been after they happened in UK many times, and in Germany many times, and if you talk about Switzerland, we cannot count the number of times. So this is a big issue, but it used not to be an issue in Scandinavian countries. So that's why we are now doing this report. The reason why we talk about whistleblowers is because whistleblowers is one of the main and most effective tools for enforcing regulations. This is even supported, we will see, from quite a lot of research. And the US, because of this, introduced, actually extended their whistleblower reward scheme that was covering fraud, government fraud, financial fraud, tax evasion, environmental malpractice. They actually extended it also to cover anti-money laundering non-compliance just a few months ago. So the question we were addressing here is why shouldn't the EU follow the US lead in doing that, in introducing a whistleblower reward program? That's the theme of this report. There's, whistleblower rewards have been discussed in relation with other issues. They are currently discussed, I think, in Sweden in relation to gang violence, but they have been discussed for other type of fraud and corruption at the European level. And now we will just focus on money laundering, but many things are common. Okay, in the report we look at some cases, 3 cases in more depth, and then an overview of other cases, all from public documents and investigation. We're not journalists and nor lawyers, so we took all the information available to us. And our conclusions, it is our view, drawn on public documents, is that some banks, even in Scandinavia, appear to have had, few banks, but appear to have had considerable knowledge of the existence of serious AML deficiencies, and they've been relatively slow in acting to remedy them. Very few cases, but substantial. In the same overview, we concluded, we perceive that there's been a problem in communication between regulated banks, those specific banks, and the supervisors. And sometimes these banks have not been transparent with supervisors, omitting information that would have been important. And then we also had the sensation, in reading all the documents, that the supervisors have been a little bit too soft sometimes in terms of trusting, being informed of these deficiencies, but then trusting assurances that it would be fixed. Now we're talking about regulators also in the Baltic countries, but not only. And they've been but relatively easy to convince that everything was good after the problems. And that's what we believe we learned from the case studies. Another thing that we learned regarding whistleblowers is that they were not there, or they did not have any effect. We looking at these case studies, neither the internal compliance functions of these institutions nor internal whistleblowers were able to induce action against these relatively serious deficiencies in anti-money laundering. You probably know about the amount of money. It was decent, small compared to many other cases in Europe, but still not negligible. And external whistleblowers were also not a force that helped redress the situation. the other were not there, they were rare, or they were not taken seriously. And we, looking at how the whistleblowers are usually treated after they blow the whistle, we look at the banking sector. It seems that the banking sector is one of the sectors that mistreat or retaliate against whistleblowers more than others. That's, again, our own impression of the history of what happened in the last 8 years. In the paper, we also do an overview of the AML, anti-money laundering regulation that started in the end of the 80s and then went on at the worldwide level, mostly pushed by the US in their fight against terrorism. So they've been pushing mostly this regulation after 9/11. The European Union published several directives trying to have a common playground in the way rules are applied in Europe. But still, we continue to see episodes of poor compliance with these rules and or deficiencies, and the problem doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem to be solved. In particular, we've been reading a lot about the debate on whether the current anti-money laundering regulation is effective at all, and whether it is cost effective. An enforcement tool can be effective but super expensive, or can be effective and cheap, or can be ineffective and super expensive. Now, we are not the expert on this, but looking at all the evaluation done by other experts and publicly available, lots of observers suggest that while this regulation is quite costly for governments and quite costly for banks, for all banks, not only for the few that have been kind of involved with these deficiencies. So the costs are spread all over the system, or the banking system. And in terms of effectiveness, we are on the low side. Some estimates, it was said at the introduction that 1% or less than 1% is the amount of criminal proceeding laundered through the financial system that is recovered, seized by law enforcement. The estimates we look at were actually less than 0.2%. Maybe this is anyway UN estimates. So in terms of effectiveness, it's not, we have to be careful. It's not so easy to judge, in the sense that it could be that so little is recovered because most of money laundering is now using parallel channels like cryptocurrencies. But even before that, suggestions were there that this system is pretty burdensome for institutions, financial institutions and governments, and not terribly effective in terms of detecting and deterring this phenomenon. Just to clarify a distinction, if only 0.2% of crime proceeds that are laundered are caught, this means that detection is super low. Now, when you enforce a regulation, you would not only want to detect, you would like to deter bad behavior. But to deter bad behavior, to prevent people to launder money, you need to show that you can detect them and punish them with a substantial probability. So the fact that there is such a low level of recovery, it means that detection is very low, which implies that deterrence is practically absent. There is no way, there is no effect. People criminals don't fear any serious threat in terms of when they launder the money. That's the conclusion from these numbers. Finally, before passing the word to Theo, so how is the future of anti-money laundering looking in the EU? So we went through the current debate, and we see that several experts, finance ministers, and also the European Commission's action plans suggest to go towards higher centralization of supervision. Okay, so creating a European anti-money laundering agency. My understanding is to do that in the spirit of as it was done for competition law, antitrust law. So to have a central agency and maintain the local agencies, and then have a network where the central agencies would deal with the biggest cases of European relevance, but would also help coordinate the local agencies when we have seen some miscoordination, for example, between the Baltic supervisory authorities and the Scandinavian ones, and there were also lack of some problem in terms of information sharing. So this is what has been proposed to improve coordination, to improve information sharing, and also to limit possible cozy relationships between regulators and regulated firms, particularly in small countries. They are often very well known to each other, and there is a lot of revolving doors that may interfere with the regulators' toughness sometimes. They also propose to increase supervisory resources. And then the protection directive for whistleblowers was approved in 2019. This is what Europe has been doing. The US instead went for rewards for whistleblowers. Just to give you a number, a few days ago, the whistleblowers that is actually reported to the Security and Commission, the LIBOR interest rate fixed between a number of large banks, there was an illegal action, received a reward of $200 million. Now, this is the highest reward that was ever paid to whistleblowers. This is because rewards are funded as a small percentage of the amount of fines and the amount of recovered assets. So he received this amount of money because he allowed to recover assets and sanctions for, let's say, 9 times or 10 times that amount. So just to give you, this is the maximum that has been reached. Why is the US going towards rewards to whistleblowers for anti-money laundering? Theo will give you the answer.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit about why the US is not only protecting whistleblowers, but also offering them substantial rewards. So we know numerous countries have had whistleblower protection laws for a very long time. We have the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the US and Public Interest Disclosure Act in the UK. But the US thinks of whistleblowers as an enforcement tool. And with respect to enforcement, protections haven't really been such a central driver of enforcement. And there are many speculations as to why this might be. So one reason has been that many forms of retaliation are very hard to prove in court. So you can have your career slow down, you can have delayed firing, you can be blacklisted in the industry, you can suffer various forms of ostracism and so on. And these forms of retaliation have been very hard to remedy. So therefore, whistleblowers often end up in a position where they're worse off, even under protection laws. In many countries, there's also been a widespread utilization of non-disclosure agreements to deter whistleblowing. And this is even in countries where non-disclosure agreements are forbidden or not enforceable under whistleblower law. So the EU directives comments on this. It says that if a whistleblower pursues all the proper channels, they should not be barred by non-enforcement agreements from talking to a regulator. But despite this, they have been used to deter whistleblowing. So in one case in the US, for example, there was a firm that required employees to sign a contract stating that if you intend to talk to the regulator, you have to inform us internally first. And then you identify the whistleblower internally, and that might in turn deter whistleblowing. So the US, as I said, has gone one step further and offer substantial rewards to whistleblowers. This practice goes far back in time, in fact, to 1863, when the False Claims Act was enacted, which protects the governments from fraud. Most recently, they've expanded these programs to many areas, so financial securities, regulations, tax evasion, ocean pollution, and most recently, money laundering. And these rewards have been partially thought of as a form of compensation for damages that are very hard to compensate for. Many whistleblowers find it very difficult to find a job in the industry that they've worked in their entire lives. So these rewards in the millions are often justified on that basis. And the programs have been widely praised by US regulators. They've been praised by the Securities and Exchange Commission, IRS personnel, and also several top prosecutors at the Department of Justice. So this is somewhat of an interesting slide just to illustrate what happened after they introduced this program. So to see how many new or how that changed the number of claims from whistleblowers they received. So this graph on the left shows the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's the securities fraud whistleblower program. The official data starts actually around 2012, and since then it has seen a steady rise in the claims received. The IRS program was enacted by amendments in 2006, so the data properly begin from around 2007, and they've seen a steady rise in claims as well, although it has fallen off in recent years. But more importantly, and the reason why reward programs have been expanded so aggressively in the US is because of the success of the False Claims Act. This is an act that protects governments from fraud. So if you're a contractor and you want a contract from the US government and you make any false claims, then you violated the False Claims Act. And this is enforceable by any citizen in the US. So if you know of contracting fraud and you have that information, you can choose to take this firm to court and take all the risks of litigation. And if you lose, you pay attorney's fees. But if you win and manage to return money to the government, then you will get a percentage of what you manage to return. And these are treble damages and usually resulting in a substantial amount of recoveries. So we can see, since it was amended in 1986, whistleblowers have effectively been taking over the enforcement job under this act. So this is a form of outsourcing or privatizing or decentralizing enforcement of various laws. And in this case, it's been highly successful. So 72% of the cases, or of the 68 billion that has been returned to the US government, in 72% of those cases, whistleblowers have been involved, whereas the Department of Justice initiate relatively few of these enforcement actions. And it's not only the impressive administrative data, it's also recent research that has drawn many people's attention to these programs. So in the last 2 decades, we've seen numerous independent studies, empirical studies, showing that these programs are highly effective at both detecting and deterring various forms of wrongdoing. So again, deterrence is highly important. It's very difficult to prove deterrence effects of sanctions. I mean, it's been very difficult to prove in many areas, but in the whistleblower reward case, we have numerous studies showing this. 2 important, one in procurement fraud, that would be the False Claims Act. We also have evidence of this with respect to insider trading, aggressive financial reporting, and also tax evasion. And then there's a lot of experimental evidence that also show that these tools, that this form of compensation can be highly effective in detecting and deterring wrongdoing. And they're also highly cost effective. So the cost effectiveness estimates of this of the False Claims Act ranges from for every $1 you spend, you get 14 to 52 back. So they're not a burden on the taxpayer. They generate money for the taxpayer. So this Carson et al. Study, there are also other studies to find similar numbers. But design matters. We consider the US programs here. I mean, all the data is on the US programs. And it's these that have the evidence in their favor. There are numerous reward programs throughout the world. In antitrust, they've been pretty common. The reward programs in antitrust typically offer very low rewards, capped around $100,000. There isn't a lot of data on these programs, but from the data available, they don't seem to have been highly effective. So then there's also been a range of concerns about these programs. Many are concerned that they may generate false, malicious, or frivolous reports, or they might crowd out intrinsic ethical motivation. So if you have an intrinsic motivation to report something and you're offered a large monetary reward, you might say, no, I don't want the reward, I want to report this because it's my duty, right? So these concerns have been quite overstated in the literature. There's not a lot of evidence or no evidence to suggest that they have been a significant problem with any of these programs. And then there is another concern that is very frequently brought up, and that's that if you have an external reward program where you offer millions of dollars to whistleblowers, why would anyone go internally into the organization and try to remedy the problems and maybe solve it at a location that's more closer to the problem? You go directly to the external regulator and cash in a large reward. And surprisingly, perhaps, this hasn't been too much of a problem either. So 83% of whistleblowers at the Securities and Exchange Commission had first reported their concerns internally before going to the regulator. And a big point of these programs is to make firms take compliance seriously and make sure they spend the resources and effort to ensure that they comply with the regulation. And if management and internal controls know that any employee have a huge incentive to go to the regulator and receive a reward, they're going to pay a lot more attention to compliance. So reward programs are also a response, not only in the AML context, but in many contexts, to sort of a failure from many corporations to self-regulate and comply out of their own will without an external force like whistleblower rewards. So yeah, that's been the main reason for their introduction. They appear highly effective. And I think, Giancarlo, you wanted to conclude with the last line?
Yes, to wrap up, from what we know from the frontier research, from US data, of course, reward for whistleblowers is the cheapest way of enforcing regulations, because they use information that is already there. So you don't need to go and send the auditors and search in the books, because you use the information of the people in the organization to make sure that organization behave. This could be done in Europe. There is no reason to think that Europe is different. It's not true. Antitrust laws were in the US there for 100 years, and then they were imported in Europe and adapted. So the same happened with leniency programs. They were introduced in the US and they were working very well there, and they were important and adapted in the EU. So there is no reason to say, but Europe is different, or we have a different legal tradition. Legal tradition change with innovation, otherwise we'll still be with Roman law. And so this could be done. It could be administered by EU central supervisor. And of course, it would be only limited to very egregious and important violation, or very serious and prolonged. There would be caps on the amount of AML that were not remedied. It should be very large cases, but it could be introduced, and this might help in terms of ex post, rather ex ante regulation. And this might actually replace some of the burdensome ex ante regulation and reduce the amount of paperwork that banks and governments need to do if we have an ex post way to discipline the regulation. Other possible action that could be improving AML compliance, after looking at what happened, is possibly a slightly longer cooling off period for regulators to go and work in their regulated banks, because at the moment it seems there is a lot of revolving doors, and maybe it's a little too much, although we know that there are benefits. The cost seems to be possibly higher at the moment. And then, yes, possibly monitoring the misuse of non-disclosure agreements that sometimes scare employees from reporting internally, externally, even though they are not supposed to do that. And I think we're done.
Thank you very much, Giancarlo and Theo. And then I would like to welcome our commentators up on the stage and on the screen. So please let me have Åsa Arffman on the screen, and Erik and Nicklas, please come up on the stage. I will introduce you. So Åsa Arffman, who we have with us digitally, is Chief Legal Counsel at the Swedish Banker Association's Bankföreningen. Erik Blommé is Deputy Director of Operational Risk Division at Swedish Financial Supervisory Authority, Finansinspektionen. And Nicklas Lundh is Head of the Financial Intelligence Unit, Swedish Police National Operation Department in Swedish Finanspolisen vid Polismyndighetens nationella operativa avdelningen, NOVA. A very welcome to all three of you. And Åsa, I would like you all to give your introductory remarks, and then we will let Giancarlo and Theo respond to the remarks. So I would like to begin with you, Åsa. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Ilinca, for inviting me to this important seminar on AML, and also thank you to Mrs. Spagnolo and Mr. Nyreröd for an interesting report. AML has been on the agenda for several years now. Despite this, I believe there's still is potential for improvements. As far as I know, the industry has an ambition to do the right thing to be compliant with AML regulations. The banks have invested heavily in compliance, especially recently. So there is a clear ambition to do the right thing. And one has to remember that banks are private companies, and that it is the authorities that shall prevent, investigate, and prosecute crime. Banks are, however, part of the solution, not the problem. The big question is how to streamline the anti-money laundering measures to become more effective. The resources are not endless, so how can we, within the frame, quickly achieve results? Surely there are many solutions, but among others, one can allocate resources to the police to prevent the appearance of offences, thereby reducing money laundering, or to the prosecutor to be able to take more cases to court, whereby criminal money can be seized, or to the supervisory authority to expand the supervision to find shortcomings in internal governance and control. Resources can also be allocated to investigate the possibility of introducing a reward system for whistleblower. All these listed areas can probably be considered important. However, I believe that an expanded possibility to share information between the FIU and the banks, and to some extent between banks, should be given priority. The joint effort between to fight financial crime between the Swedish police and the largest bank in Sweden have shown the potential of information sharing. The cooperation has resulted in large amount of crime money have been seized much earlier than would have happened without the cooperation. An extended possibility to share information would open the possibility of stopping crime money at an earlier stage, to identify modus and trend at an earlier stage, and also to prevent billions from firm shopping between banks. I believe that a better setup for information sharing would create an environment where we actually could gain results in the fight against money laundering. And we have received approval from a recent government committee. The committee has submitted proposals for changes in the AML regulation, aiming at making the fight against money laundering more efficient. One of the proposals is to open up for information sharing to a greater extent. And I hope that the proposal will become a reality really soon. So thank you.
Let us invite back on the screen Giancarlo and Theo, and let us hear what you have to say about Åsa's focus on information sharing and also her other remarks.
Absolutely. I mean, if I can say two things. Information sharing is essential. In some cases, though, information sharing was possible and was not done, possibly purposefully. In that case, it wouldn't help to improve information sharing if one party is not sharing the information. So in that cases would help to have some more enforcement tool. But otherwise, I fully agree that the information sharing was the whole point, is the important point. But sometimes even the banks don't have the information clear enough if they don't put enough resources into looking for this information. That's what we have seen in the past. So I fully agree that there are many things in which we can invest, and information sharing is important. That said, the proposal of whistleblowers rewards is not about investing, in the sense that these rewards usually pay for themselves 15 to 50 times. So this is not invest. We don't need to invest resources. Why should we gain resources by introducing rewards for whistleblowers? It's slightly different.
Thank you, Giancarlo. So, Theo, would you like to add something, or?
Well, we're not suggesting that whistleblower rewards would be the only solution. It surely would not. But the problem from the recent sort of scandals have been a non-compliance by the banks with the present regulations. And to solve that problem, whistleblower rewards looks to be a promising solution. But again, the framework itself might not be adequate to do the job it's intended to do, such as deter predicate offenses, for example. And then you might not want to enhance compliance with a framework that isn't effective in itself. So, but yeah, whistleblower rewards is not the only solution, but it's a highly effective solution to ensure compliance with regulatory rules.
Thank you, Theo. So then let us move on to Erik Blommé from Finansinspektionen.
Thank you for inviting me here to speak today, and thank you also to Professor Spagnolo and Mr. Nyreröd for their research and this well-written report. I thought I would use my few minutes here to reflect a bit on whistleblowing from my perspective as a supervisor, and give a bit of context to the landscape that we are operating in right now and how it has evolved over the last few years. And I thought I should start by perhaps stating the obvious, that there is no doubt that whistleblowing is an important part of an effective AML regime, and it definitely has its place. And I'm glad to see the work being done by Professor Spagnolo and Mr. Nyreröd to promote this in the research. But at the same time, and as I think the report points out, whistleblowing is primarily useful when the company's own organization and the three lines of defense has failed. And my main objective as a supervisor is basically to ensure that the organization does work and that the banks do what is expected of them in this area, both proactively and through means of inspection and other supervisory measures. And I think a very significant step to achieve that is to create an awareness among senior management and to sort of help them foster a corporate culture where AML is considered a priority in all aspects of a company's operations. And I think that most stakeholders today has a level of awareness that was not around 10 or even 5 years ago. And we also see several examples of this in our supervision, and how this has led to an increased focus on these issues. More resources are allocated, and a lot more work is done to implement an effective AML safety system. And hopefully this means that the need for blowing the whistle would decrease over time, but that of course remains to be seen. I would also like to put whistleblowing in a bit more context from a risk perspective. Because as we can see in the report, most examples of successful whistleblowing cases are from large global corporations and financial institutions. But we must keep in mind that AML CFT regime, as we see today, is very much risk-based in nature. And as a supervisor, we must direct our efforts to where we see the highest risk and where we can be most effective. And as the big banks become better, the criminals need to find other ways to launder money. And this means that the risks might shift and new risks emerge, crypto being one of them, and various cash-intensive businesses being another. And these are primarily smaller companies, whereas when we think of whistleblowing, we often think of only the big business perspective. So one interesting question, I think, is how whistleblowing could fit into these other categories and what could be done to promote whistleblowing in that context. And lastly, I would like to say something on what other challenges we are facing from an effectiveness perspective and what is being done to address these issues. And also touched upon this in her introductory remarks as well, because as we know, creating an effective AML regime is very much a team effort. And one of the main challenges that has been in focus over the past few years is the need for better cooperation and information sharing within this ecosystem. And as also mentioned, we just had a report, it was a 600-page report on the effectiveness of the Swedish regime, and where one of the main outcomes is these new legislative proposals on how to better promote cooperation and information sharing. both among authorities and other obliged entities, and both horizontally and vertically. And this has been on the wish list from both the private and the public sector for some time, and it's something that we are really looking forward to. Another challenge is that money laundering is a global phenomenon and a cross-border issue, whereas AML supervision and to some degree AML regulation is local. And this is something that the European Commission has tried to address in their new comprehensive AML package that was presented in July. And the main ingredients there are this new centralized authority called the AMLA, which will have both direct supervision and indirect supervision of all obliged entities within the Union. Another ingredient is the more harmonized single rule book, placing crypto also on a level playing field with the rest of the financial institutions. And hopefully this will lead to a greater convergence in both regulation and supervision and allow us to better address the cross-border risks of money laundering that we see today. But of course, an effective AML machinery has many moving parts, and one of them is of course whistleblowing. And I think this report is a very valuable contribution to that discussion and to see how we can promote an even more effective AML regime in Sweden and the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik. So I pass the word to you, Giancarlo and Theo, to comment on Erik's remarks.
I mean, we are more or less in line, I would say. The question on how to deal with smaller businesses is important in the sense that if you blow the whistle, you might be blacklisted, okay? It happened in big countries where you have millions of firms. If you do it in small countries where you have 10, 20 firms in the same field, there is a big issue of being retaliated and kicked out of not being hired again. So for big corporations, as was mentioned, there will be big rewards that compensate for that. What about smaller businesses? Maybe in smaller businesses we can think about protection. Usually, one reason why the rewards are capped is because there is at the end also a procedure that needs to validate that what the whistleblower reported was correct. Investigations are costly. So the reason why they are so effective in the US is exactly that they limit it to very egregious cases, very serious cases. I would not advise to have small whistleblower rewards program with very low fines, because then sometimes this could actually backfire for whistleblowers in the sense that the money could be too little to protect themselves from retaliation, and then there could be a stigma in addition to it that worsens the case. So I think whistleblowers rewards should be there, should be large, or should not be there, just like in the US. And then in that case, protection should be a better solution, but we should be aware that protection is always insufficient to protect from whistleblowers from retaliation. So then you would maybe consider anonymous sort of way of reporting to whistleblowers, keeping the identity of the whistleblowers anonymous, and then you would need, of course, a legal regime that allows to do that, because then at a certain point, the investigation must become public when you go to court and so on. That's my view on the small cases. Do you want to add something, Theo?
No, I agree with what you said and the previous speaker. So.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Then I would like to let Nicklas Lundh from the Financial Intelligence Unit at the police come into the conversation.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. And thank you for presenting a very offensive report in terms of being on the forehand, looking forward to new possibilities. I'm delighted to be here today. Well, to start off, the police is not the decided authority as a recipient of whistleblower reports. The FSA is. However, the FIU have the role as a sole recipient of suspicious transactions and suspicious activities related to money laundering or terrorist financing. We also have a responsibility to forward any relevant information to the authority deemed best to handle the case. Sometimes it is within the police, and sometimes we forward the reports to tax authority, security police, or economic crime agency, etc. We are also the recipients of reports based on an obliged entity's judgment on a merely deviation from an expected customer profile, a proposed use of institutions' products, or suspicious business activities. And we are the recipients of those reports from some 23 branches and with thousands of obliged entities. I think it's a very important point being made that we have a legislation here aiming at the protection of whistleblowers, and not in the more offensive way in terms of perhaps calling them bounty hunters. The focus here today is on compliance, and the regulation is quite clear, I think. The MLA regulation, the protection of whistleblowers, is very clear. It's stated in the paragraphs related to the protection itself, the need for routines for reporting, and the level of compensation when blowing the whistle. As a principle, of course, we would like to have all the information necessary and possible when we see illegal activities. And that goes for all our colleagues as well. So, as was mentioned here, the need to change information between FIUs is very, very important. I would like also to point out that suggesting a reward program such as the ones mentioned here in the report should probably also be put in the context that we do have not seen these reward programs in other types of crimes. So we suggest that in that case a lot more further investigation will be needed. If you look at numbers, it would be hard to argue that the combined system through the whole money laundering chain is 100% effective. Of course, we have to recognize that. But the sheer amount of legislative actions, the increase of personnel, the updated directives and regulations, and new collaborations point to the fact that we ourselves believe that we could do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicklas. And over to you, Giancarlo and Theo.
No, I agree. Do you have any comments on that, or?
I mean, yes, I agree that rewards have not been used before in most European countries, right? This was the same for leniency programs against cartels until 1996. Then we introduced them, inspired by the US, and they turned out to be super effective. So yes, we need further studies, we need further thinking on how to integrate tools, if we want to integrate it, into a different framework. I agree, we need to further evaluate this. So this is, our report is a proposal to evaluate seriously these very, very cheap and effective tools, because all the other tools we've been discussing might improve effectiveness, which according to not our estimates, but other estimates, seems to be very low and the cost very high. This is a tool with cost very low and affects very high effectiveness. So it's a really, I mean, if you talk to a US regulator, you look at the number, is a game changer. It's a big bomb, of course. If there are big cases, this will be limited again only to serious cases. And there's been very few, actually less than one or two in Scandinavia. But there are several, I mean, we can talk about the European perspective here. There are bigger financial institutions in other countries, both in the EU and outside the EU, for which money laundering is like a habit. And it's very, very large. And so in this sense, our proposal was looking more broadly about Europe, given that we are integrating markets and the banks are expanding all over, and it would be difficult to just focus on the situation of one country. So yes, we should study this more. That was the point of our report to push the idea that even we could think about a very effective tool in Europe as well.
Thank you. So I have, of course, a lot of questions to all of you, but I would like to open the floor also to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and you will get the mic, and then you can introduce yourself and pose your questions. And while you that are here with us today think, maybe we have some questions from the audience that are with us digitally. And Angelica, please pose one question at a time.
Yes, we have a question from Carl Philip Bergström, professor at the Department of Law at Uppsala University. And it goes, could Professor Spagnolo and Mr. Nyreröd explain why the EU legislature has been hesitant to combine whistleblowing with rewards or bounties?
There may be many reasons, some of which are difficult. But let's put it like this. The biggest European countries, in particular the biggest European countries, has been the least prone countries in Europe in terms of protecting whistleblowers. And a lot of industries have been lobbying against introduction of any protection for whistleblowers, not rewards. If you look at the debate before the introduction of the EU directive for the protection of whistleblowers, you will see that big industrial associations from Central and Northern Europe have been arguing that the whistleblowers were already very protected before this directive, which is a joke because some of these countries have been actually sentenced as against crime against humanity for the way they mistreated the whistleblower when they were right. Then when you guess how come they would something like the Dieselgate has been going on for 10, 15, 20 years and no one has spoken about that. Or Wirecard has been doing what it's been doing for 20 years and nobody has spoken about that, then you understand what the climate in Europe is. That's, I would say, is my reason. European industry don't want whistleblowers. That's why the Commission did not want to introduce it.
Thank you. So do we have any questions from you here? Please, just wait for the microphone.
My name is Björn Riese. Thank you for the report. Very interesting. I have not read it carefully yet, but I have glanced it through, and I think there are a lot of thoughts. In the Swedish society, I think the most common, or a very common at least, start of an investigation, whether from the SFA or the police, is actually a whistleblowing to media. And I think Swedes are very confident that media will never disclose the name of the whistleblower. And in a sense, this is a competition to the system you suggest. I think it would be interesting to hear how you see this in parallel, because I think if you think about the scandals in Sweden, I think they, if not all of them, actually started with reporting to media. Probably sometimes from disappointed employees that have tried the internal way, but it didn't work. Thank you.
Thank you, Björn. I would like to hear you, Giancarlo, and Theo's comments on that, but it would also be interesting to hear from Erik and Nicklas on this matter. So, but please start, Giancarlo.
Yes, I mean, going to media as an anonymous source shifts the burden of proof on the journalist, and then may alert, of course, the authority. But the amount of information that can be disclosed and the way a journalist can evaluate the quality of information is very different to the way in which a supervisor can evaluate that technical information. So these are not substitutes, okay? Nobody would ever prevent, hopefully, I mean, before the media disappear because Facebook takes all the market, until we still have media, there would be no reason, no way to limit this channel. But it's somewhat very different channels because technically journalists are not I mean, don't have the expertise to evaluate a lot of information. When information is very, very, very serious, then of course the journalists will be able to recognize and they will bring the case up. So these are alternative channels, I would say, and they will not bite on each other. Probably they will attract different type of reports. Last thing, of course, if somebody reports to media and then is not anonymous, it will be exposed to retaliation. And if so, a whistleblower to the media will never go and testify in court because it's unprotected and they will not have the rewards. So if we want more information to be disclosed, we need to think about additional measures. That's the way I see it.
Thank you. And of course also to you, Åsa, and Nicklas and Erik, what do you see the role of the media and does it in preventing and also investigating and money laundering? I mean, does it help you or does it hinder you? Or who would like to go first? Nicklas.
Well, a quick take on that. Of course, things do show up in media, and when it comes to our attention, we have to investigate it further to see if there's any substance in the allegations and the claims. This, of course, this happens, but at the same time, it happens quite a lot in different areas. So we have to quite fast find out, is there actually an illegal activity going on, or is it a moral shout out for something which the whistleblower is lifting. But of course, if it comes to our attention, we have to look into it. Yes.
Åsa and Erik, do you have any comments? Åsa and then Erik. Sorry, Åsa, go ahead.
Yes, I think it's a good thing that the whistleblower could go to media because it's. If there is wrongdoing, it should be taken care of. And if they go to the media, then it's the authorities' task to take it further, I think. So it's a good way.
Erik?
Well, I also agree. I think the media definitely has a role to play here and bringing light into these circumstances and making it possible for us as a supervisor and maybe for Nicklas as well to prioritize what is reported on. So absolutely. The proposal from Giancarlo and Theo is based on programs that have been implemented in the US, and we have a tendency here in Sweden and in Europe to turn to the US to get new ideas. But of course, there's always this potential that things cannot be imported directly from the US to Europe and to Sweden. Do you have any comments on that? I mean, how would it work to implement a whistleblowing reward program that has been successful, evidently, as the researchers have shown in the report, in the US to Europe and Sweden? Is there something in the context here that may do that it wouldn't work as efficiently here? I think it would be a challenge, to say the least. I think that there are, of course, valid arguments in the report pointing to the upsides of reward program of that kind, but whether or not there are stronger counter arguments, maybe coming from a different perspective, I'm not the right person to say. But I think this would definitely be an anomaly in the Swedish context and perhaps in the EU context as well for most member states. And I think it's important to apply sort of a holistic view when you look at initiatives such as this, not only from the AML perspective, but also taking into consideration other areas such as law enforcement, etc., where there are similar dynamics, where we have not seen any such initiative take form as of yet. So a challenge.
Would you like to respond to that, Giancarlo or Theo?
Sure. We also see that a challenge. The US tends to be more direct and conflictual, forms of enforcement. In Europe, we are more soft in terms of about everything. But as we said, I used to work in antitrust. In antitrust, in the US, they introduced the leniency program in '93 that gives full immunity to the first person in the cartel that reports the other. And it became the game changer. And now almost all cases of cartels are discovered that way. And then Europe decided to try to import it at the European level and at local level. Now every single competition authority in Europe has its own leniency program imported from the US. They had to learn to use it. They learned from the US mistakes. That was an advantage because they didn't have to do the same mistakes that the US have been doing and learn from that. They could already have the package with the past mistake done by the US, and it worked very well. It is still working very well. So yes, there is some learning. It's a challenge. The reason why it hasn't been done before, given how poor we are in discovering big corporate scandals, from corruption to other stuff. The way we see with Theo is that we could try. We're not so bad compared to the Americans. We might make it.
Also, Nicklas, would you like to add something to this, the question of how to implement an American program in the US or in Sweden?
No, I just agree with Eric. I don't have any further. Using whistleblowers, of course, is to some extent a failure of the system. And if you want to change that, it has to be further investigated. And that was my point.
Åsa, and then after Åsa, we have also a question from the audience. But please, Åsa.
Yes, I believe whistleblower system is part of the system we have today, and it will be increased next. The protection of the whistleblower will be increased next month with the new law, and I think we should evaluate that law before we go any further. But whistleblowing is I think you have to have it, and you have to act on when they blow the whistle, the blow. So. And also you have you have to have a broader perspective. You have to see to labor law also which protect the whistleblower. And they have quite a good protection in Sweden, I think.
Thank you. Then please, from the audience.
Yes, I'm Annika Kreutzer. I am a journalist and I'm also board of one of the Swedish banks nowadays. I was thinking in the States, it's easier to give a reward than in Sweden because we have this tax system that's rather official here. When I worked in media, we wanted sometimes to give a reward, but at the same time, the protection of the whistleblower was more important. All incomes are official in Sweden, so it's very easy to track down who was the whistleblower if you gave some sort of reward. So how can you use the American system in Sweden when our tax system is as official as it is? That's my question.
Giancarlo or Theo, would you like to respond?
Yeah, just to clarify, I think the question was about rewarding secret whistleblowers. Now, we didn't discuss these cases. What we have in mind is whistleblowers that afterwards become known because they tend to testify in court and be part of the investigation. So behind underlying our report is the idea that the figure of whistleblowers that discloses this information, not that remains secret. Rewarding secret whistleblowers is very delicate. Of course, the press may do that. But then they will not be able to testify, of course. So it's a slightly different idea. What we have been discussing till now is a former employee that reports, and then it will be also disclosed in terms of identity after it reports outside. The internal or secret is another topic that we actually didn't discuss, but it would be actually interesting to discuss, of course. But
I just add that in the US, in order to report anonymously, you need a legal counsel who knows the identity of the whistleblower, but that's not known to the regulator. So that's how it works in the US. I don't know if that would help the tax question, but in order to report anonymously in the US, you need to do that through a counsel. So
Yeah, but the taxes should be paid anyway, I think.
Yeah, maybe could be some exemption. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, if
Yeah,
we
what
leave
foster-
the proposal of whistleblower programs for a while and go back to the researcher's description of how it's working today. I mean, you have been touched upon it in your remarks already, but would you like to elaborate a little on what Giancarlo and Theo said about the banks having some knowledge of MLA, of money laundering deficiencies at several levels for a long time, that there has not been enough transparency, and that some supervisors have been, maybe too soft. Would you like to comment on these descriptions of the field today? Åsa?
No. There are, of course, you can't be compliant. Everyone is not compliant, but I think there's a lot of effort putting in this area, and the banks are put a lot of resources into to be compliant with this regulation. And I think the regulation is quite difficult. It is hard to follow it, because it's a frame when you should put in your own decisions, and the decisions, whether it's a high risk or low risk, is something you have to communicate with the supervisory authority. So I think to be better prepared, you have to have an increased information sharing. Then we will reach a status where we could actually fight money laundering. Otherwise, I think we will just do things around. But I think we have to focus on the criminals, how to get them away, so we don't have any money to launder.
Erik?
Well, I think to start, I think it's a very big spectrum on where your level of compliance and how much focus you are putting on that from the companies, from the bank's perspective. But I do believe that the bulk on that spectrum has shifted towards a more to a stage where this is recognized as an important issue and a risk that you have to really consider and work actively on. So I think that there is a shift here, but there's still the spectrum, of course. So I think we will see non-compliance in the future as well, of course. But I think it's I would say that it's getting better. I hope so.
Nicklas?
Well, my take on this is that we, in principle, are going in the right direction altogether. The knowledge of these issues have been raised over the last years, and if I just look on the side from the information that we get, there's a vast increase in reports to the FIU. There is an increase in reports that we take further to formal investigations. There is an increase in freezing on funds going on as we speak. And we do help other cases, because sometimes just the money laundering part of it is not shown, but it is actually helping other cases to move forward, since we can open the door in terms of finding the criminal flows. So I think also that the information sharing that we are witnessing today is going the right way. There is formal cooperation, of course, between 16 authorities. There is a formal feedback from the FIU to the obliged entities. There is a daily contact with the obliged entities. And there are formal agreements between authorities to focus on these issues. So I'm not saying that we are on top of everything, but we are definitely raising this issue and going in the right direction, I'd like to say.
But is there any risk if, because the researcher brought up also the problem with maybe too cozy relations between supervisory agencies and the supervised institutions such as banks. If information gathering and information sharing and cooperation increases, is there a risk that the relationships will become too cozy? Åsa?
I don't think it's cozy today, and I don't think it will be cozy tomorrow if we have an increased information sharing.
Also, I would like to pick up on something that Erik said in his introductory remark about the importance of raising the awareness among senior management in the banks, and also creating or sort of strengthening the culture to be aware and work with preventing money laundering. And you said that the banks are investing heavily in compliance. And could you elaborate a little bit on this more softer maybe parts of sort of how to strengthen yourself to as a bank against money laundering?
I don't know really how banks do within them, but as an association we have a discussion on how to make the culture in the bank go from the top to the bottom, and also to have policies which contain ethics and also how to react towards customer. But we don't, as an association, don't take part in the day-to-day business.
Giancarlo and Theo, do you have any comment to this? I mean, the importance of the culture in bank and other financial institutions?
My view is that, I mean, this is, for most banks, this is not an issue. The culture, I mean, the culture, there's been a literature on the culture in the banking system. I don't want to enter that. But I want to stress that one thing that we point out is that the costs of a strict regulation and on every, it is borne by all the banks, while the cases in which there was problem were limited to very, very few banks. So the spirit behind our proposal is to kind of stop adding cost and ex-ante rules that are borne by all the banking system, just because a couple of banks might misbehave. So one reason why we are so sympathetic to these effective tools is an effective tool that it doesn't impose costs on banks. If banks are able to control that their employees behave and have a healthy corporate culture, they have nothing to fear, and they will have lower costs if we don't. If we continue to add rules and rules and rules. In Italy, I come from Italy. Italy is a hyper-regulated country, and then but the way in which we say, there is a way of saying, done the rule, found the trick. So as soon as a new rule is published, somebody will find a trick to circumvent it. So I'm not a big believer of rules and regulation ex ante. I believe it would be better for most, 99% of the banks, to have a tougher enforcement on information provided to whistleblowers, because they would not have to build additional costs and compliance costs. And then only the very few banks commit serious deficiencies will be sanctioned harder based on information coming from whistleblowers. That's a view that perhaps I didn't stress before, but I think it would benefit a lot most of the banks.
Okay, thank you. I think that that was a fine concluding remark for this seminar, and I would like to thank Giancarlo Spagnolo and Theo Nyreröd for a very interesting report and presentation, and I hope you all go home now and read it carefully and discuss this, because of course this discussion isn't over with this seminar. I would also like to thank, of course, our commentators, Åsa Arffman, Nicklas Lundh and Erik Blommé, for participating, and of course also you in the audience. And before I let you go, I would like to recommend two upcoming events here at SNS. The first is about the OECD's digital taxation proposal and takes place on November 15th. And among the speakers are AstraZeneca's CFO, Yvonne Bertlin, as well as law professors Mattias Dahlberg and Pernilla Renberg, specialized in finance and taxation, respectively. And the second is about compliance programs to enforce social standards in global supply chains, with Professor Richard Locke from Brown University. He is an internationally respected scholar and authority on international labor rights and corporate responsibility, and that seminar takes place on November 17th. And you can find more information and also the possibility to register to these events on our website. And with those words, I would like to say good afternoon and goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.